most of the toddlers right now are congregated in one area, but just in case, it is 11:30, or it's past 11:30, which means that it's time to go to Tat Shabbat. So if you've got kids or grandkids who are ready to go to Tat Shabbat, now is the time. Shabbat Shalom. This past Tuesday, at the presidential inaugural prayer service, Bishop Marion Edgar Bood of the Washington National Cathedral spoke at first indirectly and then directly to the president and the newest leaders of our nation. Now, a little side comment here. Each commentator seems to pronounce her last name differently, so if you know the correct pronunciation, please correct me after the service. Bishop Bood began with a plea for a threefold unity consisting of, first, a recognition of the inherent dignity of every human being, as she says. Second, honesty in both private conversation and public discourse. And third, humility, which we all need because we are fallible human beings. While the first 12 minutes of Bishop Bood's sermon imply a challenge to the leaders sitting in the room, and yes, all of the big names are there, her last 3 minutes speak to them directly. In the name of our God, she says, addressing the president by name, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. As the bishop asks the president and his leadership team to consider the humanity of LGBTQ teens in families of all political affiliations, as well as the humanity of immigrants and refugees, she no longer masks the challenge and the criticism implied in her first 12 minutes. She is speaking directly to those who have created and are creating policies that either diminish or remove the rights for those for whom she is asking mercy. It takes a whole lot of courage to bring a challenge or a critique to anyone, let alone one of the most powerful human beings on the planet. But what takes even more courage is the task of receiving critique and challenge with those themes of dignity, honesty, and humility. In response to the bishop's sermon, however, that courage of respectfully receiving critique and challenge has not been shown a whole lot over the past few days. Public responses and personal correspondence with the bishop have run the gamut from unrepeatable name-calling to death threats to calls for her deportation. While I hope that these commentators and these leaders' internal dialogues have been more complex than their words, there has not been a whole lot of coverage, none that I know of people acknowledging the humanity and concern behind the people Bishop Bood mentions in her sermon, or truly, even the humanity of Bishop Bood herself. With this week's Parsha in particular, I find it impossible not to compare the concerns that the bishop brings to the leaders in front of her with the situation of Moshe pleading to Pharaoh to let his people go. Just as Bishop Bood and the people for whom she asks mercy have not been acknowledged in response to her sermon, Moshe and the people Israel are not acknowledged when Moshe asks for a modicum of freedom for his people. In Parshat Vaera, Moshe approaches Pharaoh time and time again with the simple plea to let his people go to worship in the wilderness for 3 days. We're not even at the point yet where he's asking to let our people go to be free. At no point does Pharaoh acknowledge the pain of those experiencing slavery in Egypt. At no point does he even say, I see what you are going through, and still, this is the best way forward. Rather, he hardens his heart again and again, wavering only temporarily when he or his people are suffering. As we learned in the middle of our Torah reading between Aliyot, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel teaches that the more one hardens their heart, the more, quote, the person afflicted is unaware not knowing what ails him, he is unable to repent and recover. The more we reject criticism and challenge outright, the harder it is to acknowledge the human possibility of our own wrongdoing. The more we practice considering the words of the person speaking against us as likely valid and as coming from a place of humanity, the more we gain access to positive impact in our lives and in the world around us. No one in this room is perfect. We've spoken about this before in this room, and I am sure that we will again. And yet, it is still difficult for us to hear that we or aspects of our values may be wrong. Among the many reasons our prayers on Yom Kippur are formulated in the first person plural, the we, is so that we can gain a sense of security in saying our al chaitz, our for the sin of X, Y, and Z, over and over. While I might not feel as willing to admit that I have trespassed God with hardness of heart, with arrogance or condescension, I may have an easier time framing it in the we and then entering into the thought process of whether or not I have committed those particular crimes. As difficult as accepting challenge and criticism may be, it is a skill that's vital to develop as we venture to live a life of mitzvot and recognition that we are all made b'tselem Elohim, with that same perfect potential of the image of God. When we are beset with a challenge from someone else, the first thing we can do in response is to take a deep breath. For many of us, our gut reaction may be to defend ourselves, to say immediately why we're in the right. However, when we move first to reaction, we might be missing an integral piece of the puzzle. If we know that we're people who do not respond well to criticism, we can always ask to move the conversation to a different time, or we can say, we do not yet have the right response. That gives us the time to consider the words we have heard and weigh the emotions that come from them. If we are able to stay in the room, we can make the time to ask questions. For example, what specific words did I use? What actions did I perform that hurt you or that you believe are incorrect or inappropriate? Why would you categorize them in that way? These questions may unearth concerns that we failed to consider or details we did not know. Depending on the criticism, such questioning might even present to us practices or viewpoints that will improve our own lives. Returning to the bishop's sermon, some questions that the president or his team could ask, and I hope are asking behind closed doors, may include, what actions have we done or words have we said that are inciting fear? What impact do you think these words or actions will have, not just on the people you mentioned, but on our country as a whole? What is your personal connection to these people for whom you ask mercy? When we still disagree, even after conversation and clarifying questions, we can still practice the humility of saying, I hear you. We can still seek to understand, even if we disagree, even if we express that disagreement. We may even accept that both of us may be correct in the end, that Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, that both these and those are the words of the living God. In our Torah reading today, after Pharaoh sees that there is harvacha from the plague of the frogs, he reverses his softness to Moshe and Aharon and hardens his heart per usual. While many of our translations write harvacha as relief from the plague of frogs, medieval commentator Ibn Ezra translates harvacha more literally as distance. After Pharaoh sees that there is distance from the plague of frogs, he hardens his heart. So too, each and every day we come across people in our surroundings and in the news whose experiences and opinions seem incredibly distant from us. They may even be geographically distant from us. Sometimes it becomes difficult to recognize the inherent dignity of every human being. And yet, We come from a tradition that emphasizes that we are all descended from the same Adam, so that, as Masechet Sanhedrin in the Talmud teaches, no one can say, my father is greater than yours. Each person in this world deserves our care, our dignity, and our honesty. And of course, each person in God's created world deserves our humility, our ability to consider and respectfully respond to their fears and their hopes alike. Shabbat Shalom. For our Musaf service today, if you would like to join John Wills in the